Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk at RSA 2023. Terry Sweeney here with Dark Reading, and joining us now is Pat Vandenberg, Director of Product Marketing with Invicti Security. Pat, thanks for joining us today on the news desk.
Really happy to be here. Thank you.
Invicti recently launched its annual spring AppSec indicator report, which tracks vulnerability trends. Can you provide some background on how that information comes together each year?
Yeah, absolutely. So probably important to note, this is the 9th year we've done this report. And also to say, the spring report is database. So we collect data from our customers, nothing private, of course, like metadata style, to get an understanding of vulnerability and scanning trends. We also have a fall edition, which is more survey-based from our customer base. So different style of input there. But so this particular report, the spring edition, we've expanded our data set this year, which is something we're quite excited about. So this data set's derived from 1.7 million scans and over 1,700 customers. So it feels to us like it's a really good profile to see, what behaviors we're seeing across our customer base and what that might expose as far as the vulnerability trends themselves.
What are some of the vulnerability trends that emerge from the data?
So I guess our biggest takeaway from this edition is a combination of scanning trends and vulnerability trends. And the first piece of that on the scanning trends is that we saw notable increase in scanning activity from 2019 to 2022, which is the time range we included in this data set. So not only did we see an increased scan rate, average scanning per month per customer, jumped 50% over the 4-year period, 13% in the last year from 2021 to 2022. We also saw scans per target, so per application scanning rate, jumped 46%. So it's not just a matter that, say, the customer base expanded, which it did, but also when customers are looking at their web assets, they're scanning them more frequently. So there was a notable behavior in increased scanning. That's a good thing. So we're seeing some perhaps maturation, broadly speaking, in application security programs to be able to scan more, shrink those windows of time between visibility of the state of vulnerabilities. So that's on the scanning side. The vulnerability trend that we saw is that from 2021 to 2022, severe vulnerabilities dropped 19% across our customer base. Severe being critical and high vulnerabilities, which all AppSec programs tend to focus on, not the mediums and lows, of course. So that's pretty notable. And what our takeaway in putting both of those together really says, as scans go up, vulnerabilities go down. Meaning the more active you get, the more you find, and the more you fix, you improve your risk.
Is any of that tied to the pandemic? I mean, what is the change in behavior? Are customers just more used to doing that, or something else?
That's a great question, and in a few different slices in this report, when we were doing the analysis of the data, the pandemic conversation did come up. It came up in an industry lens and in some general questions. You could say the dynamics across the pandemic where there was more digitization in different businesses, manufacturing being one of them. If you look at a lot of the supply chains that suddenly had to figure out how to digitize parts of the supply chain, they would have had to push functionality into the digital spectrum, virtual systems, much quicker than they would have planned to. So perhaps along with that, there was an initiative to apply some security alongside. So we did see a surge in scanning activity. Now, we also saw in the Log4Shell vulnerability activity that there was a behavioral response and scanning activity coming from that. So is that pandemic related? Is it breach related? There was also the executive order that mandated more scanning. So we actually saw a number of notable triggers that contributed to some of the scanning surge. Yeah.
In addition, it seems like you uncovered some instances of remote code execution increasing some 40% between 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, we did.
What was up with that?
That was an interesting one. So we profiled half a dozen severe vulnerabilities, by the way, in this report. But one of the ones that stood out to us was remote code execution. And So from 2021 to 2022, as he said, 40% increase. That's notable. That's worth calling out and looking at. Now, this one's interesting because it could go both ways. The prevalence is actually quite low, which is a good thing.
Right.
But it's also critical vulnerability. Bad thing. And so somebody might argue, wow, we're barely seeing it in general. Practices are pretty good to identify it and remove this from applications. But we're also seeing from 2019 to 2020, 2021, 2022, consistent uptick. So we wanted to certainly share with our customer base in the market that, okay, maybe the prevalence is pretty good, maybe we're doing a good job, but it's a critical vulnerability and there might be something concerning here of an upwards trend. And the National Vulnerability Database is seeing an increased percentage of CVE, RCE vulnerabilities. So we know there's something there to keep an eye on.
All right. You mentioned the Log4Shell incident and the Apache Log4j that occurred in 2021. This has given security professionals an incentive to up their game here. Are you seeing other effects among DevSecOps professionals that emerged from Log4Shell and that particular malware?
I think certainly the behavior in the scanning activity would suggest a bit of a scare effect, right? So whether it wasn't dozens or hundreds of companies that were breached, right? Where you had the few incidents of these major breaches. So what we're really talking about is the industry reacting to it, or in a particular industry reacting to it and say, okay, we better get smart about this. So we did see a surge, and very much so in the manufacturing industry, where we saw that spike in that 1 year trailing that breach activity. But what we also saw, which I think is a credit, is a bit of maintaining a new plateau of scanning activity. So it wasn't just a one-off and we're done. It was, well, this works. We have a better sense of security that we're doing the right things here. Let's continue with this more mature scanning practice of getting closer to a continuous scanning rate. And there's one interesting part that we saw in a subset of the manufacturing space where customers are adopting dynamic testing in the CI/CD pipeline.
Okay.
So write it at as close as possible to verifying that vulnerability in compiled code and letting the developer know there's something to address right away. So this is helping the developer process overall.
Do you think this trend is sustainable, or do we have to wait for your next report?
Well, there's a few different aspects of this report that we're noting to keep an eye on what trends are going to emerge in the next one. But as far as the behaviors that we're seeing with the customers is sustainable, absolutely. And we've seen these trends in other aspects, static analysis, software composition analysis, maybe more organic to a developer's mindset. They're well adopted. So the only tick forward here is better or more widespread adoption of dynamic security testing in the CI/CD pipeline, which flows right into the DevOps processes. So that is absolutely sustainable.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm curious if, given the amount of pressure on development teams in general to push out more code and innovate and do all the things that we expect from software, how might these teams leverage these findings to improve their own AppSec programs?
Yeah, I think this subset of the manufacturing space is a bit of a beacon for the rest of the industry. We've been talking about this. There's this idea of shifting left that's confusing to some. They talk about the development infinity cycle. So, if we simplify the DevOps process, maybe one dimension chronologically, where the earlier you are in the life of that application, the earlier we can get all forms of testing applied, so that the time from a developer doing their coding to identifying issues they need to deal with shortens, that's less disruptive for them.
Sure.
And with cloud native application development, the rapid pace, rapid updates that are happening, they have even greater pressures than they have even in past years to turn over that code and deploy it. So we're kind of in a window here where the more that dynamic testing, the later dynamic testing happens, the more disruptive it is for development, even more so than, say, a decade ago or pick a time period. So if we can get DAST testing closer to that step for developers, it's more complementary to the way they want to work on a day-to-day basis, which means it's easier for them and quicker for them to address these security flaws, support the rapid deployment of applications, and we've got better collaboration and trust between development and AppSec teams. So I think this adopting dynamic application security testing and CI/CD pipelines is absolutely the way to go.
Great stuff. Pat, some terrific insights into how to improve the AppSec security cycle, and better yet, backed up by real data. Thanks so much for joining us on the Dark Reading News Desk.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking to Pat Vandenberg of Invicti Security. This has been Terry Sweeney for the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks for joining us for this segment. We'll see you next time.